We'll start with Leah. Will you introduce yourself and your connections to long-term ecological research sites?
Sure. My name is Leah Wilson. I am from Oregon. And so I have been hanging out, doing a lot of work in the H.B. Andrews experimental forest. That's an LTER forest in the Cascades. And it's a rainforest. We get tons and tons of rain there. And we have very large trees. So we've got some old growth stands there, which is really interesting because we can look at the difference between old growth forests and forests that have been logged. Most of our forests have been logged. It's lush and lots of water, obviously because it rains, but lots of creeks come through there. And I've been there working for about 10 years, and I'll get into more of that later. I think that's pretty much all you want to know, right? Okay, yeah, there you go.
Lindsey?
Good. Well, thanks. It's great to be here. My name is Lindsey Rustad, and I am a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service. And I work kind of just down the road at Hubbard Brook, although I also have an office over in Durham, New Hampshire, right by the University of New Hampshire. And I've spent the last 35 years trying to figure out what makes northern forests tick, and particularly how they respond to and hopefully recover from like big disturbances like acid rain or climate change or extreme weather events. And I've had the great privilege to work at Hubbard Brook for most of my professional life. I actually came there back in 1983. When I was doing my master's, I went off to do some other things, and then I came back full time in 1997, and I've worked there ever since. And I've spent most of the last 15 years being what we call the team leader of the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, and just stepped down back in October to put on a new hat to be the director of the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, which instead of generating the baseline information on how our forests are responding to climate change, trying to get that information out to foresters and farmers and people who actually need to use that information. So yeah, I have a long-term history of working at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest and also collaborating with other forests across the country. I'll leave it there.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Blundell. I started as an ecologist and a geologist before that. And so I sort of separate my experiences with long-term research stations and also just field stations in general, which are the places that scientists go to do like ecological research. So I kind of separated into two phases. The first was my formative phase when I was doing research, and I was, sort of young researcher doing a lot of field work. And it's one of those places that I could just continue my love of being outside, being in nature. And so they were just this. So I spent a lot of time at field stations really around the world, from East Africa, Central America, a lot in North America, the Caribbean. So for me, they were really sort of like Airbnb, like for like really cool expeditions, and I just, fell in love with the research that was going on, but also just the habitats. So that's my historical sort of phase. And now most recently, for many years, like 20 years, I've been trying to figure out a way to make field stations not more relevant, but more known, like what they are and what their potential is for getting people to have a deeper relationship with nature. And so I've, throughout the years, I've tried to figure out ways to either film programs, do like films at these places, or programs or workshops, things like that. And, so that extends over maybe 20 years, but just recently, because I think that I think our culture is sort of shifting and sort of realizing that the human relationship to nature is sort of it's unhealthy. It's not we've become decoupled, or we feel disconnected from nature. So I feel like there's just recently been a surge in an openness for these kinds of places to invite people in to see what goes on there and to use them for more than just scientific research, but more like broad ecological engagement. I guess that's the way to say it. And it's been really exciting because, I don't know, it just feels like there's a lot more enthusiasm and openness. And so right now I'm associated with the Hubbard Brook experimental station just up the road, because this was one of the habitats that I fell in love with. You know, I kind of grew up in these habitats. And so it's been really great to kind of come home. And Lindsey's been amazing and invited Rita and myself, we're collaborators, to come spend time in the forest. And we're hoping to also do that in other places as well. So that's my, but that was the question, right? Like, what's our relationship to them now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rita Leduc. I am a visual artist. And I guess my focus as a visual artist is on systems and relationships. And the way that I gain most of that expertise is by working with place. And so when Rich and I approached Hubbard Brook, I was looking for a field station because I had gone to residencies working with place, but I wanted to go somewhere where there are other people there falling in love with that place and doing research at that place as well. And so Rich and I kind of formed a collaborative team with this project called Ecology Extended. And we had been in contact for a while, but this was really our first official collaboration that we were embarking on. And the idea was to go into the forest. And when I extend my practice into the forest, I'm using myself as a sensor. I've always felt like I was sort of a porous membrane. And so in my practice, I kind of go out into place and try to let the place into me. And what's so amazing at Hubbard Brook is I am able to use myself as a sensor and my collaborator as a sensor with all of his knowledge as well. And then in addition, I get the forest as a sensor, and I get all of the scientific instruments that are also out there sensing. And so I'm able to achieve a much fuller understanding of what this place is and what is entering into me, and then what I'm kind of expelling out. And then it creates this real reciprocal relationship that I then build and create work from.
And it was kind of cool when Rita and I started working together, we discovered that we were both in love with the White Mountains. So Hubbard Brook was like the kind of natural.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time here as a kid. Yeah. Yep.
All right, I'm Peter Groffman. I am a professor at the City University of New York, and I am an ecosystem ecologist and a biogeochemist. And what does that mean, right? So an ecosystem ecologist studies ecosystems as a unit of nature. So I don't study birds or lizards. I kind of study the whole amalgam of trees and soil and animals and all the abiotic conditions, and they function as a system, and they have this ability to capture energy from the sun, and they use that to take carbon out of the atmosphere and support a food chain. And so I'm a systems ecologist, not an organismal ecologist. And I consider myself to be the luckiest ecologist on the planet, mostly because I get to work at Hubbard Brook just up the road. And there's a couple of things about Hubbard Brook that make it a great place to work. So the two things are just the large community of people, and then just the fact that we're able to do things for the long term. And so having a community and having a long-term community allows us to do better science. So in environmental science, we can't work alone. I think many of us have the image of a scientist with a lab coat and thick glasses, working alone in the laboratory late at night and with bubbling glassware, convoluted glassware going crackle and pop late at night. And you just can't do that, right? In environmental science, if we're going to study how ecosystems work, there's got to be someone who knows something about the soil and something about the plants and something about the climate and something about the microorganisms and the animals, and then increasingly someone who has an aesthetic perspective, which is why we get very excited to collaborate with artists, because we're understanding these systems in their relationship to people. And so boy, artists are good at that. I can measure stuff all day and into the night, but artists are just incredibly gifted in that ability to have an impression of a place and express that in a way that's meaningful on a bunch of different levels. And so we do better science because we have a community, and we have a community that includes artists. And it also allows us to have a better impact of our science. So most of us are interested in collecting. Like, I really like collecting scientific data, and I do it, but I also would like the scientific data to be useful to people, to help people to make better decisions about the environment and how they live and how they vote and how they talk to people. And so that impact is a problem. Scientists tend to be miserable at communicating their science results. We use a lot of big words and we tend to talk down to people. So if we work with, and this is a great thing at Hubbard Brook, is if we work with educators and outreach specialists, and we work with artists who are also spending a lot of time conveying impressions to people, our science has a better impact. So I'm a lucky scientist because I work with a nice community, and I work with a nice community in the long term. And I guess I'll say one more thing about the long term. Is if you can do things if you have a few months to do something, you can get some things done. But if you have 20 years, I've been working at Hubbard Brook since 1992, right? So that's a long time already. I've been sitting in a room with Lindsey Rustad, for 30 years, and as a result, I think we make a lot more progress because we've been given a long term to work to understand a complex system. And so it's nice to have a community. It's nice to be long term, and it's fun to work in the White Mountains.
Thanks, Peter. So I think we'll start back with Leah, and I'd like to have each of you talk a little bit about, so as we talked just kind of briefly, our in-person audience are, students all in their capstone, I think all graduating in May. And so I wanted to have each of you talk a little bit about how you find and have found community through your practice, whichever form that takes for each of you.
Specifically for LTER?
No.
Okay.
I mean, I think,
That's a great question.
Well, it could be specific. Do you want me to say yes? Should I say yes?
That's a good question. Sure. So I'm a visual artist, I'm a writer, and I'm a storyteller. And so the way that I form and find my communities is through that most of the time, but I'm also coming through all of this as an outdoors person. So I was an outdoor educator for a long time. I taught kayaking. So I also find community through the kayaking. And now I find that through the forest, through my art and writing and the kayaking, there's actually a lot of overlap. So I have been, I've been in the forest working at the Andrews Forest, really developing a long-term relationship with the place. Like a lot of us, we don't really have a connection to the place like people used to have connections with the place. I've moved around a lot is what I'm saying in my life. And so I don't feel very connected to the place that I grew up in. I moved away to go to school, moved away from that place. Kept thinking that I was in the place that I was going to settle down and find my place, and then I would find myself uprooted again. So I'm always finding a way to form some roots. And so that's with place, and with place comes community. And so as I get to know the forest itself, and I feel more comfortable in the forest, then I became more comfortable with the people who are working in the forest and with the scientists. So I don't have a science background at all. At first, it was a little intimidating for me to go out with scientists because it felt like it was a different world. They were speaking a different language and they were doing something completely different from me. But as I came to know the place and love the place, I found that their work and what brings them to their work, and it gives them a relationship too. So they love the place, and there's a point of entry right there. And so within that point of entry, then we can start to talk about the different ways that we see the place and experience the place. And that's been really fantastic because what that gives me is another view of the place through somebody else's eyes. And then when I have a conversation with one of the scientists, tell them what I'm interested in thinking about, a lot of times they'll recommend another place for me to see, which leads me to another place, another person to talk to. So that's one way. And then in the forest also, we've been having writers and philosophers come into the forest for the past 20 years. And then for the past 10 years, I was one of the first visual artists to come in. And since me, there have been quite a few other artists that have come in. And then I'll go to the forest a lot of the times when they are there on their residencies, and I'll come to see the way that they're working, show them some of the places that I've been to. And so that's a way that I can form relationships with the artists that are coming through there. And then that's been great too, because we've been able to, with some of them, I've been able to do some projects that kind of work with each other. So I wouldn't say that I've ever collaborated with anybody in the traditional collaborative sense. But what happens is they'll see some of the work that I've done there, they'll talk to somebody, and then they'll do their work in their own way that responds to what I've done. So there's a conversation that's happening along with that. And then another fun thing that I can do is when somebody seems willing and able, I've been able to take some people down the river to show them that part of my world too. So it's all just weaving together in interesting ways. And the more people that I come across in this community, the more it spreads out. So that's actually why I'm here too. It's spread all the way across the country. And now
You're seeing it happen right now.
In community with all of these people and the people behind you too. And part of my original community from Oregon is back there at that table, and you're in Michigan now, and we're all over the place. It's actually quite cool how organically community grows when you go into a place really open to the people that are there and the ways that they see things, because you just don't know where you're going to end up. It's so cool. It's so much fun. It's great. Yeah.
And so it's such a great question. And as I was listening to Leah, I was thinking where I find community, and I have over the years, is through shared passions and shared interest in things. So and concern about things. So I actually started out when I was in college. I was a liberal arts major and I studied philosophy. And at the same time, I always loved the outdoors, and darned if where I went to school, they didn't make me take a distribution requirement. They made me take a science. And so I took that science really stubbornly, and it turned out that I loved learning more about the natural world. And so I went from there to do a master's in forest science and a PhD in plant science. But where I found community was with people who, again, what I was saying before, really wanted to figure out how ecosystems worked. Right, how they ticked, how the matter, energy, and water flowed kind of into them and through them and out of them, and sustain the life and all the interrelated processes. I just found that fascinating. And then superimposed on that were these bigger things that were happening in the world that were kind of threatening places I loved. And I came of age in the 1970s and the 1980s. And the big issue back then was acid rain. And Peter remembers studying acid rain. And acid rain was actually discovered right up here at Hubbard Brook, at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest. But it was a threat to our ecosystems, and we didn't know that much about it. And so from the science community that came together around this was to try and understand how the system responded to to increasing acidity, and then whether it could recover from that. And Peter alluded to this community of scientists that none of us have the capacity to understand the whole ecosystem as a whole. And so that the beauty of this field and the magic, I think, or part of the magic of what we do at Hubbard Brook is we're a community of scientists. We're biologists, we're geologists, we're chemists, all coming together to figure out how these systems work. So we went through acid rain, and then there was an issue of there was too much nitrogen. And so we studied this thing called nitrogen saturation. And then in the beginning of the 1990s, we were beginning to recognize that CO2 was going up in the atmosphere. And we actually knew since the 1800s that as you increase CO2, it serves to trap gas heat and actually warm the atmosphere. So there was this inkling that something was going to go on. We called it global warming back then, and we now know it's far more than warming. So I started working with another community of scientists that wanted to figure out how, in my case, forests responded to this new emerging threat. And so I've actually been studying the impact of climate change on forest ecosystems, but since the early 1990s. And then more recently, we know as the climate is changing, it's resulting in an increase in kind of the frequency and kind of severity of weather events, right? We're having more wacky weather, windstorms and rainstorms and cold spells and hot spells. So now a lot of my research is focused on how our forests respond to this kind of wacky weather that we have. And I'm often interested we use the word resilient, how tough are our forests? I mean, I push Leah. How much can she push back before she falls over? And so that's what I try and do with forests. And I do that within community of scientists. And because forests and a lot of ecosystems evolve over time, I think we're going to talk about time in a little bit, so I get ahead of myself. It is so important to be able to study them on their own terms, right? You can't put a forest in a test tube, right, and study it overnight. You have to study it over decades and even over centuries. So having places like Hubbard Brook, where scientists from around the region, from around the country can come together to study this forest, understand what makes it tick and how it responds to some of these large scale experiences. And I have to say, one of the things that we've learned is that science and science alone can't figure this all out. And this is why that I have, over the last decade of my career, begun to reach out to artists. And when I say artists, I say artists writ large, right? Artists and philosophers and writers and poets and musicians, across the board to help us understand these same phenomena. These folks look at the same thing I'm looking at, but through a different lens, and by working with them, it gives me greater insight on the forest. So there are lots of reasons that I work with forests, but just as I work with geologists and soil scientists and physiologists, I now feel that working with artists, is part of my community of practice. So kind of went on that, but.
Okay, well, I've just been taking some notes here, and the word that shows up a lot in my notes is this word expand. So there's something expansive that I'm going to talk about, I guess. And so the first expansion, I think, is to expand on what the idea of community actually means. Because my sort of initial community was, I grew up on a farm. It was a community of livestock and, plants and things. And then it was the woods, and it was the bay. I was a commercial fisherman for a long time. I used to pull lobster traps, and there was a community that came up in the trap, and I really started to identify with that community. I felt really close to it, and that became a practice of feeling close to and connected to the communities that I was immersed in. And I know I'm not mentioning anything about human communities right now, but I think that's the expansion. I think is really important, that we expand our ideas of community from just the natural world, from just the human world to the natural world. So that's the first expansion. The second one expands on what Leah said And she was talking about the people that she meets out on the trail. And I get that too. There are people who I meet and, you get to talking and you realize that you have a similar sense of connection to nature. And that's why you're out there. You're out there to kind of be in reverence of what you love. And that is a practice that has led to community. And then I actually remember being a scientist and interacting with the scientific community in much the same way that you're talking. So I'm really expanding on what you're saying too. But also you mentioned that you had connected through your work with people who felt a sense of concern or a sense of passion for the subjects that and I feel that too now. Like I feel that there's a community out there of people who feel a deep sense of urgency, a growing sense of urgency, in a sense that something's wrong, like something's broken, something's injured in us. And I'm like starting to really find community out there of people that feel that way, but I'm not meeting them on the trail, I'm meeting them on the internet. So the internet has become this real well of people that are bubbling up, to use your word. And I feel that there's this sense of community that's developed around that as well. Okay, and the last sense of expansion that I think is relevant is the one that Rita kind of represents, and she'll talk about it in a minute, but I was a scientist. I never, throughout my entire scientific career as a student, never once was I asked to take an art course or do art or, and now that I realize the importance and the essential role that art can play in getting us to wake up to nature, to reestablish our connection to nature. This artistic community is now I'm interacting with, and it's the most uncomfortable I've ever been interacting with the art world. And we just went to a gallery and I was just like, this is good stuff, right? It turns out it was. So anyway, yeah, I guess that's what I would say. But all of it boils down to, again, the real practice, the real core of the practice is to just be with the places, be with the people, and spend time, listening to places and to people occasionally. I try. But anyway, so yeah, that's what I would say about how I find community in my practice.
This is Rita again. I think folks online are having trouble telling which of us is talking. So just
Rita here. I'm realizing the benefits and the drawbacks of being on a panel and the fourth in line, sorry, Peter, of people who I really respect and agree with much of what they say. So I'm like, okay, can't say that, but like, just listen to what they're saying. But so I'll try to expand on it. I was also going to take it to like the literal ground level, right? So I mentioned before how my artistic practice teaches me things. And when I go out into place, I'm trying to establish relationships with the parts of that place in order to put them back together and create a relational whole. And so I make friends with rocks and I make friends with trees and I make friends with like cracks in the sidewalk and bricks. And I go back to them and I look forward to seeing them and I have to give as much as I get. And it just creates this like amazing dialogue, which then becomes reciprocal, which then just becomes a whole again with me as part of it. And so I like to say that I search, I listen, I participate, and then I become part of. And that's what I say when I talk about my art practice. But I could say the same thing when I talk about how I met Leah. I don't know who found who, but we found each other, right? And then how Rich and I found each other, and how, I mean, the three of these people sitting right here, like you need to understand the extent to which like they matter to me. Like they are such solid pillars of my community, and I'm so grateful for them. And it's because of this searching, listening, participating, and becoming. And that's about process. So that's not about me saying, I got to go and find myself a community. That's about me saying, I'm going to search and listen and participate. And then that becoming is just going to happen. And so I think sneaking time in here just real quick, it is about the long-term relationships. And it takes time, and it takes time and it takes commitment, and it takes vulnerability, and it takes trust. And so like, we've all been through it together, and we're going through it together, right? And we're trusting each other, and we're being vulnerable with each other, but we're also committed to each other. And that's what makes like a resilient community. So.
Peter, do you have more you want to add to thoughts about finding community?
I do.
Good.
So I already talked a little bit about community and just how having a community of people allows me to do better science and for my science to have more of an impact. And I would just reiterate that again. I have been at least 4 times a year. I sit in a room with Lindsey and with about 10 or 15 other people, and we've been sitting together for 30 years. And that's just it's a wonderful intellectual community, and it's also just it's just fun. You know, there's a kinship there, the kinship in science. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things about maintaining that community and renewing that community and expanding that community. So I'm old, and I've realized that for these projects, this research project, right? So we've had generations and generations of people, and the project will fail unless we can attract new young people to come into the project and make their careers here. And so we're very interested in this constant process of renewal. And it means we have to be nice, and we have to be welcoming, and we have to be opening. Otherwise, young people are not going to come want to work in our site. The other thing that we realized and is that we need to expand the group of people in the site, right? So we have a big focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our site. And so when I started in science, right back in the late 40s, early 50s, it was all white men. And now it's the gender balance, at least in ecology, is about 50-50, which is good. We're still real short on people of color. We've had an awakening in the last 5-10 years or so that, I mean, so Megan gave this beautiful land acknowledgement at the beginning of our session today, but that's a relatively recent addition, and I'm glad we've woken up. And I'm glad we're making some efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're a little late to coming to it. We do think that engaging with artists and with art students is really going to help us in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we want all kinds of audiences to realize that there's a place for them in science and there's a place for them in nature. And I think I can tell them that, but I think our art students here in the room probably are maybe better ambassadors for that. So I just wanted to say something about, yes, we have built a community, but we have to renew the community, and we have to expand the community if we're going to be successful and happy.
Thanks, Peter. So the next kind of piece of this that I wanted to talk about, and I think there's a thread of this already, not surprisingly, but shifting a little bit to talk about the why. Why is there value in this engagement in communities, right? So why, we've talked about, yes, you have it and yes, you want it, but a little more of the why. Where's the value for you in this engagement with communities that you've built and found? Leah, if you start for us.
She's not asking me very small questions.
No.
By the way, these are kind of huge questions. So,
Yeah, 3 minutes. Yeah.
So I want to start with Rita over here, because Rita, Mrs. Leah speaking. So even though I've been working in the same place with the same community for a very long time, I hadn't really come across people who were doing something similar to what I was doing. And so I was still feeling pretty alone. Even my art friends were doing something sort of close, but not all that close. And so they didn't really even get what I was doing. You know, people in the forest, same thing, sort of, but not really. But through all of those communities that were sort of not really doing what it is that I was doing, and I was feeling pretty alone, somebody in my community who happened to overlap with Rita's community that she was forming somehow said, you need to talk to each other. And this was over 2 years ago that happened. And so Rita and I think it was you, It doesn't really matter who it was then. We don't remember anymore. But we started talking over 2 years ago and we have not stopped talking. And we talk and talk and talk. And if I have a problem with art, if I'm having frustrations about what's happening in the forest, if I have something exciting that's happening, and now if I have something that's happening, you know, like with my life and with my family, one of the first people that I contact is Rita over here. I had never met Rita in person until Saturday. So she picked me up from the airport and drove me over here. And that was the first time that we had ever met in person. And she is one of the most valuable people that I have in my life, because she's one of the few people that I know that's doing what it is that I'm doing and really gets what it is that I'm doing. And it's been such a hard journey to do what it is that I'm doing, fun and exhilarating and never boring at all. But it feels very lonely and feels like an uphill battle because I didn't really have anybody to do it with, like the way that I was doing until I met Rita. She's gonna cry. Sorry, Rita. So I just can't stress the value of that enough. It just like it was a life changer to have that happen. So that's the biggest one, the big value that I want to say. And then other ways, bring them back to the forest. I'm pretty small. I ask small questions because I don't know really all that much about the forest. So I go out there, I ask pretty, what I think are lame questions, ask them to the forest and ask them to my community. And then what I get in return just expands that so much. And so the value that I get from that is I take my small question and it becomes like way bigger. What I get way bigger, my art becomes way bigger. The way I get to interact with the forest becomes way, way, way bigger. So for instance, like I wanted to see the way that the light changed from the forest floor to above the forest canopy. So that was kind of my question. How does the light change? And so in order to be able to see how the light changed, I needed to be able to experience the forest as the tree kind of experiences the forest, which is vertically instead of horizontally, like we walk horizontally along the earth. So I needed to find somebody who can show me the vertical aspect of the forest. So my community over there connected me with somebody who then taught me how to climb a tree. And so I got to climb an old growth tree and hang out 150 feet up in the air, standing on this little branch like throughout the year. So I could see the way that the light changed throughout the year. I didn't do that on my own. You know, that all came from community. And so that one little thing right there became the backbone for this project that I did that added a whole bunch of other things that I needed to have more community members help me with this thing. And then it ended up being this very, very large scale public art project, and it's in a permanent collection now at Oregon State University. So I could not have done that without community. So the value of that again is just massive. And so being able to do such a massively huge project like that, then puts me in contact with so many more interesting people. And then of course, you know, what I can do just grows and grows and grows. So I can go on the value of community forever, but I'm going to let Lindsey talk.
So again, I think we could all talk about community at different levels, but since this is coming at the culmination of this workshop we just held on the integration of art and science at long-term ecological research sites on not just Hubbard Brook, but H.C. Andrews and forests across the country. I want to think about the value of the community of artists and scientists coming together. And first of all, this is nothing new, right? I studied ancient philosophy, and the artists and scientists have been coming together since the beginning of time. But I also kind of came of age in the 20th century, right? And that was at a time where science was the answer to everything, right? Science put a man on the moon, and it was a man. Science solved the riddle of life in terms of DNA. Science solved hunger in terms of the Green Revolution. Science split the atom. And so I was kind of grew up in that science was the answer to everything. And then lo and behold, we came into the 21st century and we had, some of these other even more complex problems. And climate change is kind of such a kind of epitome of them, that climate change, we understand the science of climate change. We kind of know what we need to do to solve the crisis of climate change, but it involves people, right? And people changing, how they live their lives, what they value. And so to me, it was a real clash of science and society. And I realized that scientists didn't have all the answers, and that we were missing something. And so when I kind of serendipitously started to work with an artist, Xavier Cortada, back in 2012, I realized that in the world of art, we were looking at some of the same kind of large scale issues, but from different points of view. And that Xavier and other artists that I've met along the way were able to help me kind of understand the relationship between science and society better. So that was kind of, one big picture. And then over the last 10 years working in this realm, I've kind of begun to think that the integration of these communities do so many things. So wonderful having, art, or one thing is having artists on site is just, the art is amazing. I mean, it's beautiful, it's inspirational. It just brings me joy. So it's kind of art for art's sake. Another thing is working with artists in the field with Xavier and with Marty Quinn and with Nikki Lind. Gosh darn it, if we weren't looking at the same darn thing, right, where, water moving through a stream, or, dew on a leaf, or listening into below ground sound, and I thought I knew what was going on. And they would ask me questions that would make me realize that I didn't really understand as well as I thought they did. So they made me rethink some of my science and ask my questions in a different way. So they were actually part of my science journey. So artists and scientists, adding to knowledge. And then another thing that I realized that artists really, had a voice in helping us reach the public and being able to communicate our science to a broader audience. Peter said it. He said, we scientists are rotten communicators, right? We use big words and we kind of stumble around, and we're not so good. And people just, when it comes down to the end of the day, don't really care that much about the nitrogen cycle or phosphorus or manganese or some of the things that get us really excited. But artists were able to communicate that in different ways, and then advocate for change. And I'm just going to, give one example of a project that I have. It's playing upstairs. It's called the Water Biz. And this is where we scientists had developed all these new sensors, right? These little things that we would put in the soil or the water, and they would gather data, and we get data at hourly intervals, and it would go to our data loggers, and it would get to our base stations, and it would go to the internet, and we would make like thousands of charts and graphs, right? Because we had all these data, right? And then I realized even we were getting apoplectic about them and cross-eyed, couldn't understand them, let alone trying to translate to them somewhere else. So we kind of crumpled up that image, and we were working with Xavier Cortada, and we said, well, what if we can take that same data and create art and create music, but let the data create the art and the music? And that's what we did upstairs. Is the data, what runs the visualization up there is data that's coming out of the watersheds, precipitation and stream flow and snow and evaporation and transpiration. All those data we have and we love, but it's creating the number of particles and the speed with which they move that's animating that visualization you see up there. And if you listen to it, those same data are creating the forest symphony that's working with Marty Quinn. So it was just a new way of communicating the data. And it's kind of, I don't know if it's embarrassing or what it is, but I think I probably get more calls to come and talk about the water biz than I do about, you know, aluminum or phosphorus or manganese up at Hubbard Brook. But the amazing thing about it is once we start talking about it, people are like, oh, that's a water cycle. And yeah, climate is changing the water cycle. And that's important. And oh, where's that coming from? It's Hubbard Brook. Well, what's Hubbard Brook? It's this long-term ecological research site. And what's that? And we have this kind of backdoor conversation, you know, that I couldn't have had otherwise. So I'm going to leave it there as I think they're big picture things of why it's important to bring these communities together. And that's just an example of something we created that has been a lot of fun. And B is just a new way of looking at our data.
Rich?
Okay, this is Rich speaking. So the question, I guess, is why is this valuable? This work, our communities. I've made a list here. I'll just do this quickly, so I won't take too much time. But the list is, well, first of all, Leah, I know you really appreciate Rita. That's what you were saying, but I just have to inform you that she's mine. So I get all those things from her too, and I don't know how you find time to do it, but so I just wanted to let you know that's coming to a close because she's mine. Well, the crazy thing too is she takes care of her family. Like, I don't know how, I really, I don't want to embarrass you. I don't want to embarrass you. So what I learned really though, is the list I have here is inspiration, which you said, and knowledge, which you said, but also like fortitude to deal with daily life. I get perspective, like on my issues how much they matter or don't matter to the world. I get perspective, I get intelligence. And I mean that as like ecological intelligence that I can use in my life, which is different than knowledge. It's not about facts. It's about how to deal with in the world. Another big one is identity. Like I identify with these places and these communities that I spend my time in. But then again, there's also immense beauty, joy, and fun. Every day I'm out on the trail all this week, just snowboarding down, and it's just, I can't explain, it's ecstatic joy from these places. I get a sense of connectedness. I feel the continuities of all things running through me. I get a sense of belonging and contentedness. Basically, I get everything from these, because that's the thing. Communities are about relationships, and everything comes from relationship. In fact, we're nothing without relationship. Relationship is everything. But the last thing I want to just say is just that the other thing I get from this, and I try to communicate, are the kind of competencies that we are going to need as a species on a finite planet in order to get through what's ahead. The troubles that we've created because we've been disconnected from the natural world, those things are going to come due in the next few decades and centuries. And what I get from community is precisely what we're going to need to get through these times. These are essential competencies. That's all.
Rita, really good answers.
Well, I get time to think about it and make notes. You should go the other way.
Come the other way.
Well, they're really good answers, and Rich went really big picture, and I feel really awkward when people talk about me. So I'm going to just like avoid all of that just happened, and I'm going to say what I was going to say, which is, I'll bring it back to the practice again and reference the ecological intelligence that Rich just referenced. When I was a kid, I was just taught that if I was having a hard time, even if I was like squirmy or bored, I was just sent outside. And so like, that's just what I do. If I'm having a hard time, I go outside. And what I have found is kind of what I've already just said is when I go outside, my membranes become porous, I dissolve. And so the weight that I feel with whatever I'm feeling gets distributed. So I get to offload and spread whatever it is I'm holding. Now, sometimes that's weight, sometimes it's levity. Like sometimes I actually want to share the beauty, the joy that I feel. I can dissolve that outward too. And then I can take on the weight that has been dissolved by something else out in the community. I can take that on, or I can receive the joy or the levity that someone else has dissolved or something else has dissolved out into the community. And so I think, like, you know, you guys are embarrassing, but like what they just said about me, I could say the exact same thing, you know, to everybody here, like that we're sharing, we're dissolving together. And that is part of what makes community just feel so freaking good. I also want to say that, like, these things are bigger than us. Like when I feel the weight, it's because it's bigger than I can hold. And when I feel the beauty and the joy, it's because it's bigger than I can hold. And so community, again, it's like a container, and it allows me to access these things that are bigger than me, so I can dissolve them, but I can still access them. And so just to be a little bit more specific, like, so Rich has a platform idea that he calls Oika. And so there's this whole community of Oika artists, Oika thinkers, thought leaders that, like, I feel like I can dissolve that part of me, this like existential crisis, the joy, all of it. I'm so grateful for that community. Part of that community also includes science. So like Rich will talk about the cosmic story, and just knowing the history of the universe. Like, knowledge in a sense can be a kind of community. Like, I have established a relationship with the cosmic story in a way that allows me to dissolve some of my existential dread deep into time, which sounds crazy, but like it actually works. And so like that segues into science and just knowing all science, like Lindsey talks about the science that's happening in the forest and how we can feel a sense of relief that there are these scientists over at Hubbard Brook working for generations, keeping track of what's going on in the forest, so that like if something trips and something's unusual, like they notice. And like that's such a relief. That's amazing. Like I'm so grateful for that. And then the art community. I mean, Leah's she's got one foot in my, you do both for me, so I get to talk to you about my science art stuff and my art stuff too. But having the art community is also really valuable if I want to talk about some, he always says, like, don't call me to talk to me about art, even though we talk about art a lot. But anyway, so having a distribution of different kinds of communities is also developing this sort of meta community that allows kind of like my passions to grow. Like, so I can now have goals that are bigger than myself, which just feels awesome. And then also like my family and like the normal world, like all of these other systems that I have to engage with when like I'm not lucky enough to be engaging with these sorts of systems, like those are communities too. And these are all tactics that I can use when I have to interface with systems and communities in that realm as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's all I wanted to say, but I kind of wanted to tee up Peter because I don't know, I'm not a systems ecologist, but something tells me that like the sorts of things that I was just talking about, if you were to actually study ecosystems, they're probably guiding us to do much of the same thing. So I don't see what you have to say about that.
Yeah, that's a great prompt. Thank you. Thank you very much. I've kind of answered this question already, and so I'll be brief and kind of summarize my answer before, but like I cannot do the science that I do without a community. And again, there's that old image of the scientists with the thick glasses and the lab coat working in the laboratory late at night. And I can't figure out how a forest works. And this is again very consistent with what Rita's saying. And the ecosystems teach us is you just can't figure out a forest on its own. And again, from a straight scientific point of view, you got to know about trees, you got to know about water, you have to know about microorganisms, you got to know about soil, you have to know about animals. And then I also think we've gotten much better at incorporating perspectives outside of the traditional science, which can ecosystem science tends to be holistic. We talk about holistic versus reductionist science, and ecosystem science tends to be much on the holistic side, where it recognizes that there are multiple components to it. But even then, it's been only recently where we've kind of woken up and said, the artists are not using the same methods that we are in science, but boy, they sure have a lot of insights into how the science works. The indigenous peoples who lived in these lands for thousands and thousands of years, they're not using our scientific methods, but boy, they got some insights into the way the system works. Religious people who are not using scientific methods have real insights into the, and so I think we're working pretty well to expand our community to do it. And then the other, I'd be curious to get some feedback from the students in the room, but I think that society has recognized that we have to work together to do things. And so when I was, in elementary school, we didn't do group projects. And I think all you students in the room probably did group projects. All starting in the 3rd grade, you got to sit and talk to the person next to you and get work done in it. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's fun and sometimes it's hard and sometimes it's not fun. But I think we recognize that. To me, I'm encouraged that our educational system has recognized that we need to work together. And I'd be curious to see if that's true for our art students here.
Thanks, Peter. So that we'll go the opposite direction for my last question. No, we're just like, no,
I liked using it as an excuse.
Oh, okay. Well, you're stripped of that excuse now. So, Peter, will you kick us off by talking a little bit, and you touched on this at the beginning, but thinking about just this long term in all of this, and you've talked about that some, but if there are other thoughts you have on the value of the long term in ecological research, in your own research practice.
So it was a great realization, and a lot of it came from the research at Hubbard Brook, where people were able to make the case that forests are complex systems and they change slowly. They're complex systems dominated by long-lived organisms. I mean, trees live a long time. And if you want to study those systems, you need to be making long-term observations. And this sounds kind of like a no-brainer, but it's very difficult to convince people into that at multiple levels. So if you think about the organizations that fund scientific research, most of they give grants, and we're very lucky to get these grants to support our research, but like they last 3 years or 5 years. And then you have to string them together, so you get a 3-year and you get another 3-year, and then you get a 5-year. And in large part due to the work up the road at Hubbard Brook, people said we need to come up with a way of ensuring that there's funding for this long-term research. And so a lot of the work at Hubbard Brook led to the formation of this long-term ecological research program, or long-term ecological research network, which we've heard about today. Hubbard Brook is a part of that network. That network began in '81. Now, the long-term ecological research at Hubbard Brook began in the '60s, and the scientists who were here in the '60s were banging on the table saying, we really need to get a new program for long-term ecological research. And it's been a big advance for us that we can collect these long-term observations. The thing that's interesting is the long-term research continues to produce surprises. So in many ways, we have been measuring the same thing at Hubbard Brook since 1963, a series of measurements in streams and in the soils and in the forest. And every now and again, we start to think we have a grip on what the forest is doing, and then we get these surprising results, right? So trees that we think ought to be just dying out because the climate's changing are doing great. We think the water, is going to be getting dirtier maybe because of the way the climate is changing. But we actually think that the chemistry of the water now is more dilute or cleaner than it was in pre-industrial times, right, before there were humans. How can that be? The system is just changing in unbelievably surprising ways. And every time we get one of these surprising results, we realize how lucky we are to have long-term support for the research. And I get all excited about this, and I've been advocating for long-term data sets, or the collection of long-term data sets in multiple disciplines, not just in ecology, but in particular in social science. And we need to know how people's attitudes have changed over time, and how their health has changed over time. And so we have this long-term data punch that we've started drinking over here, and I think it's just really enables us to learn fundamentally important things about complex systems that we would not learn without it.
Rita?
Yeah, hi, Rita speaking. I'll change it up and I'll start at the human level this time. Because I like to always say, like, I think this is a value that is actually still established at the human level in our society. Like, we are still we value long-term relationships, right? And I'll always say, like, you would never hear someone say, like, hey, so like this friendship has been going really great, but I'm pretty sure I know everything there is to know about you. So like, I think it's done, right? Like you don't hear that. The idea, like the goal is to like have relationships, friendships, partnerships that like you're always learning something new about that person. And why? Because time, because change, because like the only constant is change. And it was so awesome. Peter sent, it's just a great example of how these sorts of collaborations happen. But I've never met Peter in person, and I like emailed Peter and I was like, I feel like you might have something that would be helpful for me. And he didn't ask about the project, and he sent me this paper about shifting baselines. And so like, that is something that they're studying, this idea that like, the idea, I'm going to try to science explain it, I guess, art explain science, but that like, yeah, the baseline, like to try to measure the constant, well, that constant is constantly shifting because time is happening and growth is happening and change is happening. And so that's why you want to invest in these long-term relationships. And so, for me, there's just such a pleasure in, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. And the more I try, the less I know. And like, that is the best. Right? Like you just get released from any sort of, I think our like Western educational system may have told us that that is not the case, that there is some way to miraculously suddenly know the thing. And what's like the secret, and it's a super good secret, is that like, you're never going to know the thing. And so what that means is that you can always keep knowing, like you can keep on trying to understand. And so it's through that process of trying to understand. And I think it's related to everything we've been talking about. And it's so like philosophy might call it aspectualization, but it's this idea of trying to come at this kind of unknown from all of these different ways. And I think like you're getting a good picture of a group of people here who do that in their own practices and then also do that through their community. That is literally what's happening here. We're trying to come at something. We don't exactly know what that thing is, but we're like using all of our different ways of seeing and knowing to try to access it. And then the last thing I'll say is like, where does that leave me? That leaves me in a space of just doing it, which is also the best. So I get to, instead of trying to get to that goal of knowing, I get to just do and again, participate. And so it's super worth it. Long-term relationships, highly recommend.
All right, this is Rich. So the question is the value of long-term relationships, right?
The value of the long-term aspects of this work.
Okay, of this work. Well, since it's relational work, it makes sense.
Yeah.
I just want to start with two conceits or two presuppositions. And the first is that the longer the relationship is, the greater the value. And in this case, when I say value, I mean value insofar as it creates a circle of concern. Like the value is, how do we care for the things around us? So I think about it, like the longer relationship you have, the more care that comes packaged to that relationship. And we're all given a lifetime to build relationships. And so, you'd think that that would be the whole of it. Like you have a single lifetime to develop relationships, and from those relationships, your circles of concern will expand, right? But here's the thing about science is that it can give us a virtual extension of a lifetime, because we can learn about things, like we can learn about knowledge from the past, which we can then append to the relationships that we live in. Does this make sense? Like we can artificially, which is a bad word, but artificially extend the relationships that we're in by the knowledge that comes. What I'm gonna have to draw a quick little diagram. I know this wasn't part of the plan, but so just for example, if I were to make a timeline, but this timeline goes down, right? And let's call this the Big Bang, the beginning. And then here's the mystery before the Big Bang that we don't know anything, right? And then here's where the first stars were ignited. Here's where the first galaxies formed. Here's where supernovas were going off. And here's where planet Earth was formed. And here's where life emerged on planet Earth. And here's where animals colonized the land, multicellularity. Here's where primates and mammals, and then you got humans here. So it's all the way up at the top of there, right? Okay, well, on the day you're born here, right, on this timeline, your circle of concern is as big as you. That's it. It's a tiny dot on this timeline. But as you learn about the history, human history, it expands out to humans. That's your circle of concern. And if you learn more and you learn about the history of life on Earth, but through biology, geology, anthropology, paleontology, you see your circle of concern is growing the more you know. Science has a way of expanding your circle of concern. And it can go all the way back, you know, to the beginning of the Earth itself. And your circle of concern then now includes the Earth. And you can go bigger. You can go out to where the planets formed. You can care about the whole solar system. You can care about the galaxy. You can care about, and see, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is a long-term relationship here. You know, and it's hard to imagine having the Big Bang as part of your circle of concern, but you can do it. And again, that's just the way I see it.
I'm going back to the forest. Hard to top the Big Bang.
Sorry, well, the force is good enough, frankly.
Yeah. So I'm just going back to, I was, when you thought about this question, I was thinking about the value of being as a scientist, being in a place, staying kind of in an ecosystem, studying the same place over the years. And Peter alluded to this, what of the part of the fascination I find is kind of making the unseen seen. So I can go out and I take a sample in a stream or analyze a leaf in, October of, 2022, and I could have done it in 21 and 20. I might have this little snippet of what happened over those 3 or 4 years, but it's really by doing these over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, you begin to see the trend. And that's what you see, for example, in air temperature, right? In climate change, it goes up one year, it goes down another, and it's all over the place. But by looking at this over time in the same place with the same tools, you can see this trend, which in this case is increasing temperature due to that elevated CO2. So to me, the value of doing our work in the same place over time is making these unseen trends seen. And it's also, and if I only had those 3 samples, I would never know what the normal was, and by looking at it over time, I get a sense of how this system is responding. So that's a much more concrete, place-based kind of why I do what I do. The joy I have in spending time with the community over time, working with Peter for 30 years, is again, we grow our knowledge together, and we have that, back to that word trust. I think we have a trust in each other, and it's something that we try to share, with people that we meet along the road. So you can't make these things happen. You can't necessarily seek them out, but you might, see this as a possibility, and where you go with your work, that there is value to place-based work and revisiting places, people, places, and things over time, seeing how the texture changes. So I'm going to stop there and pass it to my friend here, Leah.
Just
take it right where you left
off. When Lindsey was talking, this is Leah, by the way. So when Lindsey was talking, I'm like nodding. Because what I found with this is just what Lindsey was saying with the long-term aspect of it and what's going into my art. What it gets back to me are just these amazing, intricate patterns and rhythms that I have. And so I've got these patterns and these rhythms that are starting to emerge within specific projects, and then from project to project to project to project. And I don't know where the heck this is going to end up going, through time, but I totally trust in that long-term commitment and what it's going to give back with something that I just could never get if I just went in and came out and did, like one basic project. I couldn't see these amazing patterns emerge. And so Lindsey, 2 days ago, took us to this, what do you call that? A barn, a shed? It was a storage area, large room. And inside this archive, because it's like a library, but there are no books in this library. There are just shelves and shelves and shelves. It's a pretty big space. And on all of the shelves are bottles, and all of the bottles have just little numbers written on their dates. And then there's another door that you go through, and you go through the door and there's more bottles, more shelves and more bottles. And Lindsey's going through the rows of them, and she's talking, and she's getting so excited, and her arms are going all over the place like this. And just like the look on her face, it's like lit up. And all that they are is bottles of wine. Water of all of the samples that were taken in the streams all the way back into the 1960s. And so I got super excited about this because I can see that if I were to go through those bottles, then I would have the most incredible patterns for my own artwork too. And so your excitement was like transferred to me because so we were both kind of like geeking out at the same time with this. But I want to take it back to the forest, my forest across the country. And one of the experimental plots over there, it's so weird. So you walk into this place and it's a bunch of logs, and the logs have these PVC pipes that are sticking out of them, and just it looks very, very random, and they're sticking out in these just kind of awkward angles. And so you come across this and it looks like it's installation art almost, but not quite, like if they put some intention into what it was that they were doing, it could actually be installation art, but they, they're scientists, so they don't care about that kind of thing. But it really is a weird place. And so what's happening there is they're studying log decomposition. And so logs take a hell of a long time to decompose, so this experiment couldn't just last for the normal cycle of the 3 years or the 5 years or whatever it is. So it was designed to last for 200 years, and that's a lot of trust that somebody else is going to pick that up, and then somebody else is going to pick that up, and somebody else is going to pick that up. But that's the only way that we're really going to understand the value of decomposition in forest and the roles that decomposition has. Is if somebody had the foresight and the commitment to do something that kind of sounds outrageous, especially with what society is telling us that we should be doing. And so I was pretty blown away that was going on over there. And so after I saw that, and after spending some time in the forest, then I decided that, well, it's only makes sense if I also make a long-term commitment. And so I kind of like got married to the forest. And so I have a lifetime commitment to this forest. And what that does for me is it gives me the opportunity to kind of like let go of some of the pressure of the next exhibition or the next project, or the next grant or whatever it is that I'm working on, because I know that the next exhibition is only this one little blip, and that's not really the real work. The real work is that whole body of work that I'm gonna end up with at the end. And who knows if probably nobody's gonna be crazy enough to pick that up after I'm gone. But you know, I hope somebody kind of picks up on it because it's so unknown, you know, what's gonna come of it. It's so exciting. And the other thing that I have then is as I'm going through and I've got these patterns that are emerging, then that becomes like the spine of what I'm doing. And then when I go to other places and I look at other things and I have other projects, those become like these little punctuations within the spine, and it puts those other projects that I'm doing into a greater context. So I have something to kind of compare it to, and it makes those other little projects that I'm doing, gives them more meaning and more, they become broader and more beautiful to me too. So it's great also to have an LTER to work out because nobody thinks I'm weird for doing this over there. They're just like, yeah, cool, stay for your life. It's great. Welcome. They totally get it. So I didn't have to explain anything to them. They just welcomed me in, and that's nice too.
So that was my list of not so small,
No, we're not small.
brief but not small questions. And so I wanted to see what questions folks here in the room have, or for those of you on Zoom, if you either want to there we go. So we have a question in the chat. So do you have a suggestion for artists who love being in the forest but long for a deeper connection between this nature and their art making? Does someone want to?
Oh, come join us at an LTER.
So that was Leah.
Yeah, and I just want to tell that person that is what we've been talking about for 3 days. Right. So this recognition that there's this emergence, and Rich kind of, you know, I keep talking about the word bubbling up of all around the country of artists, and they've always come to Florida to work, you know, but working side by side with scientists at these long-term research sides. So there are a growing number of opportunities, and honestly, we came together to try to better understand what's going on here at Hubbard Brook, why it's meaningful, and how we can produce more opportunities going forward. So I think this is a great time to be kind of in the forefront of this emerging or re-emerging, you know, interest in artists working side by side with scientists at these long-term ecological research sites, be they forests or grasslands, or in some sort of, you know, agricultural farmlands.
I want to,
Rita.
yeah, I'm interpreting the question differently. And so Patty, I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting it, but I'm going to just take a stab anyway. Because what I hear here is, you know, we're not always in the forest, right? Like we have lives, we have jobs, like we can't always be in the forest. Some people don't even really want to be in the forest or in nature or whatever, but they might want some sort of a tether to it somehow. And so in my practice, when I talk about, I mean, I talked a lot about here what I do while I'm at the place, but when I talked about that porosity, that like porous membrane of my body, brain, you know, and letting things in. And there are ways that there are things that I do in the forest where I'm collecting what I call qualia, like, so like, you know, I take materials out there. So I have things that I end up bringing back to the studio, but I also have myself and like my implicit and explicit memories of the experiences that I had with that place. So somehow that place is in me, and it's in the art objects, the things. I mean, they're like, it's not quite art yet by the time, you know, it's like data, I guess, for lack of a better, and I bring it back to the studio. And so I take very seriously, like my job when I am on site is to be the sensor. Like when I say that I'm like, I am like the conduit, I'm the container, I'm trying to like get as much, I'm also giving back out, and I'm becoming and participating in all of that. But I gotta kind of like take it back to the studio. And so when I'm in the studio and I'm in dialogue with that site, this is part of why we call our project Ecology Extended, because the idea here is to like, for us to be in there on the ground, somehow infuse it into us, into the work in the studio, so that then when we put it out into the world, there's some part of that experience in place that gets translated through the work. And so this was something that I used to sort of talk about, but I was always like a little bit embarrassed to talk about because it sounds a little woo-woo. And like meeting Rich was like a really great, there was some affirmation there where we like, and like we're constantly like learning about cognitive science. That's like, and even just, was it Wednesday night, we met Mike Casey, who's a neuroscientist at Dartmouth, and we're talking to him about this, and he's like, yeah, this is real. And so that's another example of like why it's so helpful to cultivate a community with many different ways of knowing, because there's this consilience where it's like, I feel like I'm doing this thing. Am I doing this thing? And they're like, no. Like there is this thing, and this is how this thing. And so anyway, I guess I just want to say to Patty, it doesn't take much. It just takes intention. It takes, like when we say long-term relationship, like you don't need to spend 10 years camping out in the forest or wherever on that sidewalk with that crack and that weed that you want to study. But like, just trust that if you put, vulnerability, commitment, time, intention, it will get into you. And then when you're in the studio, it's there with you. So.
Can I take it?
Yeah.
Patty, thank you for your question. I think I know you, Patty. I think she took an OICA course a while back, but I would suggest that you take that former, which is love, seriously, and then the latter, the longing, will feed each other. So you're really talking about both sides of the same coin there. The love and the longing are two sides of the same coin, and they're actually, to put it into ecological terms, that is a positive feedback loop. It's not a predator-prey relationship. It's actually a positive feedback loop, and that there's a reciprocity in there. So all I can say is just keep doing what you're doing if that's what you're doing. So that's my suggestion.
Are there, before we go to the next question in the chat, are there any questions in the room here? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I love the Hubbard Brook. I spent a lot of time there. And I grew up in Brook and have a lot of tree and rock friends in there. So I made some beautiful friends. And so from all that, like, thank you guys for being ambassadors for that amazing place and protectors. And I just had a question because we're having this conversation about art and science and the conversation we have together. Do any of you have favorite examples of like art explaining science or science explaining art?
So I want to answer the second part of your question of science explaining the art, because that's what I finally find is starting to happen for me. And it's just, I wish I had examples I could show you because it kind of makes me laugh. Because a lot of the scientists will, they'll put together slides, that aren't really the most, it's like they like to do with graphs. It's like that, they're not really the most aesthetically pleasing slides out there. I've taken some of my artwork and then like drawn like graphs and things like that on top of it to show what it is that I'm doing. And then they have like little like lines leading to my artwork. So how the artwork then like translates to, the graph that they make, but it's going from like, I'm not working from data. I go and I collect all of my own information when I'm out there because, I'm answering my own questions. And so, I do it in my own way, but I do kind of call it like, I'm collecting visual data out there. And then to see that translated back into like the science lexicon with all of those charts and graphs and stuff like that, but using my actual artwork, and they're using that to explain things to their students. I just have to show you, but it's happening and it's hilarious. It's fun. I'm excited about it.
I have, it's a great story. That's kind of the holy grail of what I personally am trying to see is, and that we've been asked at where we've been thinking about it, this workshop is there are many reasons for artists' work to integrate with scientists, but part of mine is, can looking at these same things impart new insights and new learning? So I do have an example. So working with artist musician Marty Quinn, and I'm into taking real-time data from sensors and translating that into art and music and helping that see pattern process, in different ways. And I'm interested in doing that because if you think of your brain, we have cognitive centers and acoustical sensors and kind of reasoning sensors. And so if we translate the data into our art and music, maybe we can hijack the brain, right? And actually more holistically understand what's going on. So I had no idea if that will work. We're working with neuroscientists to see if there's some possibility that would work. But my example is Marty had taken real-time data from the Hubbard Brook, and he was creating these color-coded graphs. It wasn't graphs, but visualizations on it. And he had one iteration that was wind direction. And he looked at the wind direction. He came to me and he said, Lindsey, there's something going on with wind direction in the Hubbard Brook Valley. And sure enough, the way he'd done his artwork, there was, vacillating, went from a dark blue to a light blue to dark blue to a light blue to a dark blue. And there was this pattern that I'd never seen before. And it turned out to be mountain valley breezes up in the valley. So that basically in the morning, it's cold air sinks. And as the day warms, there's this kind of tipping point where all of a sudden the air mass starts moving up the valley and the direction of the wind changes. And then when the sun goes down, it starts to cool and it starts going down the valley. And it's a pattern that happens every single day. I mean, there are other big atmospheric conditions that interfere with it, but he could see it in the artwork and he brought it to my attention. And then we're working with Eric Kelsey, who's a professor here at PSU. And now there's a whole program on mountain valley breezes at Hubbard Brook that was in part, independently, but in part inspired by observations through art. So I am firmly convinced that there are patterns and processes that you will see in your artwork that I might not pick up, that you will illuminate and you will share with me and expand my knowledge. So to me, that's kind of the holy grail of does this happen? And I'm convinced that it can. So that was one example.
That's cool. It's super cool.
Yeah, I just have another example to offer, which I think kind of ties a little bit into David's question as well. So I mentioned the Oika community earlier, and part of the context that the Oika art community provides is, we're a bunch of artists, we make our work, and part of what we try to then do with the work is create context around it. So I make mostly abstract work, and that's not for everyone, but there's a lot of things in the work that I would love to talk about, that I would love for people to be able to access, and that's not everyone's language. And so part of the collaboration with Rich is that he's here to help kind of create that context. And so we go on panels and we do workshops, but he also creates videos and talks about the art that I'm making. And so Rich, he described his history as a scientist, but then he also has his master's in science communication. He's a cultural communicator, essentially. And so in these videos, he will talk about, we have a conversation about the work, and we're working together constantly anyway. So he's already embedded in the work, and the collaboration is already embedded in the work, but then I go in the studio and then we touch base, and so it's this real reciprocal, constantly emerging thing. But then he'll create these videos that are interpretive, and he talks about where he sees the science in the videos, but he also talks about it in a way that it's not just science speak. And so he expands it outward to broader kind of cultural context, so that it's an entry point for anyone. And so that's been something that's been really important to me, as someone who embeds a lot of these principles and practices into my work, but doesn't necessarily always get to talk about that level of thinking. It's really helpful to offer multiple entry points from multiple perspectives so that we can create a conversation, which ultimately what happens after you start conversations, you have relationships. So it's just another way of building those.
And so we had a question in the chat about, I think in some ways I'm gonna kind of summarize it and whether there's a reciprocity, right? So we've talked a lot about folks going to the forest, artists and scientists who might live, you know, a few hours away or 5 hours or 6 hours away in Peter's case, you know, coming to the forest. But the question is in part about the scientists going to the artist studios. And so we've talked a little bit about the kind of intersections with the artists and scientists and that kind of reciprocity. But does anyone want to talk about that kind of studio visit aspect?
I could speak briefly about that because I am, you know, I was trained in the sciences. I'm not actively doing scientific research, but I still consider myself a scientist. And I got a chance to go into Rita's studio and see her work. And I've also spent, you know, I spent a lot of time with her in the field, watching her work, watching her process, seeing the ecological dynamics play out right there. And then, but one of my PhD dissertation was about how does that transform someone? How does someone get transformed by an experience in the woods? And then, and there's this one concept called motivated use, which means some knowledge or some insight or some intelligence gets into you and you apply it somewhere else in your life. I saw a perfect example of this when I visited Rita in her studio, because I saw how what had been communicated to her by the forest in the forest, she had transported, motivated, used it back in the studio. And I could see it. That's how she brings the forest back into her studio. And here's the really important insight. That means the forest has kind of gotten into her. She becomes the vehicle for that intelligence. And then she can then convey that intelligence into the work. And then hopefully that work, the artwork, can convey it back into culture. I mean, isn't that the point? Isn't that what artists do, create culture? And so I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I've seen it. I've seen it work in all of its technical detail right there before my eyes by visiting her in her studio.
I also will add that the questions that he asks in the studio are awesome. Like, it's so great to have non-artists come in and ask questions. And if we can just break that sort of, there's like a, you know, people get nervous, especially, you know, with like fine art or abstract, you know, there's this, but if you can get people who are like not artists to come into the studio and have them feel comfortable to ask questions, I've gotten so much out of those questions, again, coming from other alternative ways of knowing.
I'm going to try to do this. Hi, David. We need to have a longer conversation about this, but so for me, I don't like to have people come into my studio space. That's my space. And so that's not really where it happens for me at all. But where I think my analogous process with this, where it does happen, is in very informal conversations. And so I'm doing a project where I'm going with scientists down to a river that is about a 4-hour drive. And during that 4-hour drive, we have the ability to, you know, talk about life, the universe, and everything. And so that gives me the opportunity to talk about my process. And so that's where all of the exciting, how do you put that in there? The two-way, they're coming into my world. That's how I'm letting them into my world is through informal conversation. And so I can see some of that informal conversation about process starting to trickle into the way that they're thinking about their data collection and different ways to do that on the river. And so this is going to be an ongoing process where we pretty much just, you know, we're at the beginning of this, and I'm going to be starting this again in March and going down there on a monthly basis for days on end. We camp down there. And I can answer your question a little bit better in this context as time goes on, because the more time I spend there with them, bringing my process into it, the more it will trickle into the process that we're doing together over there. And I find that super exciting, but I have to report back to you.
Peter, had you unmuted at some point? Did you want to add to this?
I mean, so it's interesting. I haven't spent much time in artist studios, but I love art galleries and I love museums. Since I was a kid, I have always enjoyed art. And so I go, and I have lots of artist friends, and so I go to see shows with them. And it's so much more fun for me than it is for them, right? Because it's like I can go in, I like this and I don't like that. And for them, it's much more fraught. You know, it's like, how does their art compare and what is this trying to say? And they're engaging with it on a much deeper level. Just by the same token, a scientific conference is a lot more fun for my artist friends than it is for me, right? Because it's much more fraught for me. I'm really deeply engaged, and how does this compare with what am I doing, and have I been wasting my time? And I think that interaction helps us both. I think going into, you know, if I go into an art exhibit with an artist, I have a somewhat of it's somewhat naive and somewhat fresher view to the art, and sometimes it helps my art friends to step back a little bit and take a broader perspective. And by the same token, when I go to scientific conferences or interact with artists, it refreshes my sense of the wonder of science. You know, I love doing science, and sometimes I'm a little worked up, you know, about this detail or that detail. And that interaction, I think letting each other into our studios or letting each other into our workspaces can help refresh our perspectives on things.
Thanks. Other questions or comments from the room?
I just want to say thank you. This was great to hear, not just talking about art, but hearing just all of your perspectives and talking about life, and your diagram was fantastic. I totally stole that in my sketchbook. So thank you for your time.
Thank
Just
you.
Talk about all of this together. It's really eye for me. I hope they got something out of it.
No, actually going off what Kimberly said, it was really cool to like hear so many drastically different perspectives, like having like Rita and Rich being like drastically different, but yet coming together is like really inspiring.
There will be some images and some of the panels that we put together for the exhibition. I'll put up on our website because this, you know, what we've been talking about and this idea of process and what it means to have these conversations is really a strong current of the exhibition. And there's more examples of scientists and artists thinking and working together in the field and in the studio upstairs in the exhibition. So thank you all.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.